When the siren blew in Richmond, California, 1,000 hands froze mid-spark. Then someone started to cheer. It was January 12, 1943, and they had just built a 14,000-ton ship in 4 days. The Germans had said it was impossible. America called it Tuesday. Flames danced across the hull of the S. Robert E. Peary, the newest of the Liberty ships, gray, ugly, and perfect. The air stank of hot metal and oil. Sparks fell like orange snow. Behind the smoke, you could barely see the faces, women in bandanas, men with soot-streaked eyes, kids barely out of high school, working in shifts that never ended. Over the loudspeaker, a calm male voice read the final tally. Liberty ship number 440 completed in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. Someone laughed. Someone cried. One man threw his gloves in the air and shouted, "We beat the clock." They didn't know it then, but they had also beaten the war's darkest prediction, that America's factories would never keep up, that democracy was too slow to survive total war. Henry J. Kaiser, the man who built this shipyard, stood on the platform, watching the crowd. He wasn't a naval man. He'd built dams, roads, hospitals, but not ships. And yet, here he was, running the fastest shipyard on Earth. "We used to think ships were born, not built," said Evelyn Hartman, a 23-year-old welder with grease under her nails. "Now we build one before the weekend." Her words made the evening edition of the Oakland Tribune. It ran with a photograph of her face next to the headline, "The girl who builds faster than Hitler." In Berlin, German propaganda dismissed it as a hoax. They called the Liberty ships cardboard coffins. In Richmond, the welders called them miracles on water. The shipyard never slept. Floodlights turned night into day. When one shift ended, another began. The clang of hammers, the hiss of acetylene torches, the metallic heartbeat of cranes never stopped. They said you could hear the shipyards from 5 miles away, a low, thunderous hum that made windows tremble. Kaiser had promised the U.S. government he could build ships like cars on an assembly line. The Navy laughed. Then he delivered 300 of them. He had imported the speed of Detroit, the stubbornness of the frontier, and the labor force of a new America. Women, immigrants, sharecroppers from the South, machinists from the Midwest, farmers from Dust Bowl towns who'd never seen an ocean before. To them, the war wasn't abstract. It was welded steel. Every seam was a heartbeat, every spark a reminder of the men freezing somewhere in the North Atlantic. In one corner of the yard, a sign hung over the mess hall door. More ships, fewer graves. They worked through injuries, through exhaustion. A nurse later recalled seeing workers asleep on benches, hands still trembling from holding torches. A few died on the job, crushed by falling beams or burned by molten steel. Their names didn't make the papers. The ships did. By the end of 1942, the United States had lost more than 200 merchant ships to German submarines. Supplies to Britain were vanishing under the waves. The country needed a miracle, and got one in the form of gray, boxy Liberty ships that could be built faster than the enemy could sink them. Each one carried 10,000 tons of cargo, tanks, ammunition, wheat, hope. They were ugly, slow, and fragile, but they kept coming, a floating tide of steel. A British officer watching them arrive at Liverpool docks said quietly, "Every one of these ships is a bullet fired at Hitler's heart." And all of it started here, in Richmond, where the smell of burning metal mixed with the sea breeze. Evelyn remembered the night the Robert E. Peary slid into the water. The crowd counted down as the last supports were cut. The hull groaned, shifted, and began to move. The sound was like thunder. 1,000 flashbulbs went off at once. For a few seconds, time froze. Then the ship touched the water, steady and whole. The cheers were deafening. In the control tower, a foreman leaned against the railing and whispered to no one in particular, "I don't know how the hell we did it." And the truth was, neither did anyone else. The shipyard's secret was buried somewhere between exhaustion and belief, a new rhythm of war where time itself had to bend. That night, the factory lights burned until dawn. Reporters called it the miracle of Richmond. But the real miracle wasn't the ship. It was the people who built it, 90,000 of them, working faster than any nation in history. And as the Robert E. Peary sailed out of San Francisco Bay, bound for the Atlantic, no one outside the shipyard knew how they'd done it. Not even most of the workers. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They didn't hammer. They didn't rivet. They welded, and in 1942, that was considered madness. Before the war, ships were stitched together with hundreds of thousands of rivets, each one hammered in by hand, 2 men to a team, the sound echoing for miles like metallic rain. It was slow, heavy, and beautiful in an old-world way. But Henry Kaiser didn't have time for beauty. He wanted speed. His theory was simple. If a car can be built in a day, why not a ship in a week? He brought that sentence to the Navy's Bureau of Ships in early 1942. They laughed him out of the room. He wasn't a naval engineer, not even an academic. He was a dam builder, a man who'd spent his life pouring concrete in deserts and mountains. But Kaiser didn't wait for permission. He started building anyway. The secret was modular construction. Instead of assembling ships from the ground up like a cathedral, his teams built sections, the bow, stern, deck, separately, in parallel, around the clock. Then the pieces were dragged by cranes and stitched together using welds instead of rivets. No one had ever tried this at such a scale. It was like reimagining the human body by making the limbs first and trusting they'd fit together later. Old shipbuilders called it insanity. Well, the ship, one foreman barked. You might as well glue it. But Kaiser didn't argue. He just hired people who believed speed mattered more than tradition. His motto, painted on a factory wall, read, "Don't wait for perfect. Launch it." The idea of welding terrified engineers. Rivets could flex under stress. Welds, they said, were brittle. In cold water, the steel might crack like glass. But there was no time to test every theory. The Atlantic was swallowing ships faster than America could build them. Every day, radio reports listed another convoy destroyed by German U-boats. Cargo ships burned in the dark while sailors clung to wreckage, watching the horizon for rescue that never came. Kaiser's answer was not more sailors, but more ships. He introduced new techniques borrowed from the automotive world, prefabricated hull plates, automated cranes, and a dizzying new culture of production. Each worker became part of a larger machine. Welders worked in 12-hour shifts, sparks flying in every direction, their faces hidden behind soot-streaked masks. By the end of 1942, the word Liberty Ship became both a symbol and a gamble. The first of them, the Patrick Henry, slid into the water at a modest ceremony with a single speech. This ship is named for a man who said, "Give me liberty or give me death. We hope she delivers liberty, not death." The Patrick Henry didn't sink. It survived the Atlantic, slow but steady. When it docked in Liverpool weeks later, newspaper headlines in London called it the ship that proved the impossible. Back in Richmond, Kaiser smiled but didn't celebrate. His shipyard was already building 20 more. He had turned war into a rhythm. Molten sparks, steel sheets, the shriek of cranes. 1,000 parts moving as one. Not everyone believed in it. The old welders still muttered that speed was dangerous, that the steel didn't have time to breathe. One night, a supervisor found an elderly shipwright sitting on a pile of scrap, staring at the glowing hull of a half-built ship. "She'll break in half," the man said softly. "Ships need to be born slow." The supervisor didn't answer. Behind them, the floodlights burned white against the fog, and the skeleton of another Liberty ship rose from the dark. The welding experiment began to spread. By mid-1943, every major shipyard on both coasts had switched to Kaiser's methods. What started as a gamble became the new normal. But with every record broken, new doubts crept in. Welding was fast, too fast. Sometimes seams looked perfect on the outside, but inside, invisible flaws were waiting. In the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, those flaws could turn into death sentences. When Kaiser's engineers raised the issue, he waved it away. "We'll fix it when we see it," he said. "Right now, we build." And so they built. Every hour, another hull was stitched together, another name painted on gray steel: John W. Brown, Jeremiah O'Brien, Robert E. Peary. Each ship carried not just cargo, but belief. Liberty ships became America's industrial heartbeat. They carried tanks, trucks, ammunition, wheat, even Christmas mail. Each one a floating promise that democracy could outproduce tyranny. At the height of production, a new Liberty ship slid into the ocean every 2 days. From Oregon to Texas, from Baltimore to Los Angeles, shipyards thundered like living creatures. Evelyn Hartman, the welder who'd helped finish the Robert E. Peary, later said in an interview, "When we worked, we forgot everything else. The war, the fear, even sleep. All we heard was the sound of metal turning into something alive. That sound, the deep, groaning hum of welding torches, became the anthem of the home front. But for all the noise, there was one thing no one said out loud. Every shortcut has a price." By the end of 1942, engineers began noticing faint cracks along some ship hulls, tiny, almost invisible lines that appeared where the welded seams met the steel plates. They called them whispers. At first, they ignored them. The ships still floated. The cargo still reached its destination. But the whispers grew louder. And by winter, they turned into something else entirely. Something that sounded a lot like braking. The trick worked, but it came with a cost no one was ready for. The first ships built at record speed started coming back. Not in triumph, but in pieces. It began with whispers from the North Atlantic. Reports of Liberty ships returning to port scarred, buckled, or worse, split in half. At first, no one believed it. The ships were America's industrial miracle, the pride of every newspaper headline. How could steel simply crack? But by the winter of 1943, the evidence was undeniable. 5 ships had gone down, not from torpedoes, not from bombs, but from the cold itself. The steel hulls, welded together under impossible deadlines, were fracturing like ice. The Navy called it brittle failure. The welders called it bad luck. One survivor from the SS Schenectady described the moment it happened. There was no explosion, just a sound, like a tree snapping in the forest. Then the deck rose up, split clean through, and the sea rushed in. Photographs arrived at the shipyards, hulls torn open like paper, engines exposed to the sky. The men and women who had built them stared at those photos in silence. Some refused to believe they were real. Evelyn Hartman remembered the meeting that followed. The foreman stood in front of hundreds of workers and said, "The ships are cracking. Nobody leaves until we find out why." They stayed all night, checking welds with flashlights, running gloved hands along the seams. The cracks weren't visible at first, but when the light hit just right, you could see them, long and thin as spiderwebs. Someone whispered, "They're breaking from the inside." The engineers blamed the steel. The steelmakers blamed the welders. The welders blamed the weather. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. They had moved faster than physics allowed. The problem wasn't the idea, it was the rush. Welding had made the ships possible, but it also made them fragile. Riveted joints could flex, welds could not. In the freezing Atlantic, that rigidity turned lethal. When the steel contracted, the seams had nowhere to go but apart. A Navy report from early 1943 reads simply, "The innovation that made us swift now threatens to destroy the fleet." At Richmond, Kaiser didn't hold a press conference. He held a meeting in a drafty warehouse with his top engineers and a handful of women who had been working the welding lines since day one. "Find the weakness," he told them, "and fix it before the next convoy sails." For 3 days, they worked through the night. The air reeked of burnt metal and coffee. They cut sections from damaged hulls and reheated them, watching how the cracks spread. They tested new filler metals, new temperatures, new techniques. One young metallurgist, a woman from Michigan named Louise Warren, was the first to see the pattern. The fractures followed the same line every time, from the corner of a hatch or a square window. Sharp angles, stress points. "Steel hates corners," she said quietly. "We built weakness into the design." Kaiser listened, nodded once, and ordered every Liberty ship from that day on to have rounded edges instead. It was a small change, but a life-saving one. Still, not everyone was convinced the danger was over. When the SS John Greenleaf Whittier launched a month later, workers held their breath as it touched water. It stayed afloat. The next one did too. But fear lingered. Every clang of a hull under strain made the welders flinch. A letter from an unknown sailor reached the Richmond yard that spring. The handwriting was shaky. "Tell the ones who built her that we still trust the steel. She creaks, but she holds. Don't stop building." That letter was pinned to the wall of the main assembly hall. For weeks, no one touched it. Kaiser's team continued their quiet battle against the laws of nature, testing alloys, heating steel differently, changing cooling times. They didn't talk about the failures anymore. They just kept working. In one of her notes, Evelyn wrote, "We thought we were just welding metal. Turns out we were welding faith together, too." By summer, the Liberty ships were sailing again in steady rhythm, carrying tanks, food, and fuel across the ocean. The newspapers went back to calling them the ships that beat Hitler. But in the yards, the welders never forgot the cracks. They checked every seam twice. Every spark of the torch carried a memory of the ships that didn't make it home. They'd learned that progress wasn't just about speed. It was about endurance, about building something that could survive the cold, the sea, and even its own creation. And deep in the Richmond yard, under the noise of cranes and sirens, the next miracle was already being planned. Because the war wasn't waiting, they had 4 days to find the next solution. Before the next convoy left for Europe, when the men went to war, the women picked up the torches. And in their hands, America's fleet began to glow. By 1943, the shipyards had changed. The deep voices were still there. The foremen, the engineers, the crane operators. But the laughter, the rhythm, the pulse of the place now came from women. Tens of thousands of them. They arrived in coveralls too big, gloves too stiff, faces pale from factory light. Housewives, waitresses, secretaries, farmhands, transformed into welders overnight. At the Richmond Kaiser shipyards alone, more than 20,000 women took up torches. Nationwide, over 200,000 women were now working in shipbuilding, building, burning, and bending steel. The newspapers called them Rosie the Riveter. But in truth, most of them weren't riveting at all. They were welding. Welding was harder, hotter, and infinitely more dangerous. The sparks burned through sleeves and hair. The fumes bit into lungs. But the women didn't flinch. Helen O'Brien, 21 years old from Oregon, remembered her first day at the torch. I couldn't even hold it steady. The flame jumped. My sleeve caught fire. The supervisor ran to help her, but Helen waved him off and kept going, smoke rising from her arm. Later, she laughed. If the boys can fight in snow, I can burn in sparks. Training took 3 weeks. That was all. 3 weeks to turn ordinary women into the hands that would weld together America's lifeline. They learned to control the blue-white flame with the delicacy of a pen, to move it like a brush, to make seams disappear in molten silver light. At night, the yards glowed. Thousands of torches flickering at once. A galaxy of fire blooming against the fog. Reporters later wrote that the shipyards looked like stars had fallen to earth. The sound never stopped. Hissing, popping, grinding. Yet within that noise was music, a rhythm of women laughing, shouting for more wire, humming swing tunes under their masks. There was competition now. Women challenged the men to welding races, who could finish a seam faster, straighter, smoother. The men laughed, until they started losing. Kaiser's inspectors noticed something extraordinary. The women's welds were cleaner, more consistent, less brittle. One supervisor said, "They've got a steadier hand, and they don't rush to prove they're strong. They just do it right." Word spread fast. The women weren't just keeping up, they were setting the new standard. Helen and her crew became known as the Torch Sisters. They welded entire hull sections in half the usual time. When one of them hit her daily quota, she'd shout, "Next ship, girls," and the others would roar back like soldiers in formation. The factory cafeteria changed, too. Posters that once showed burly men now showed women with torches, their faces lit by flame. One read, "The girl who welds the ship wins the war." Still, it wasn't easy. Some nights, when the fog rolled in from the bay, the sparks seemed to vanish into mist, and the metal sweated with condensation. Torches sputtered, and hands blistered. But no one stopped. The war didn't pause for weather. Evelyn Hartman, now a line supervisor, wrote to her brother fighting in Italy. "We don't hear the guns here, but every time I strike a weld, I think of you. You fire bullets. I fire ships." By late 1943, something miraculous happened. The cracks were gone. The hull failures that had haunted the Liberty ships vanished almost completely. The new welds, stronger, smoother, tempered by patience and precision, held fast across every sea. The engineers ran the tests twice, then 3 times, unable to believe it. One of them finally said, half joking, half reverent, "Guess we just needed a woman's touch." That winter, when the SS Helen O'Brien, named after a young welder who'd been burned but never quit, slid down the ramp into the water, the shipyard crowd erupted. The torches were lowered, the sparks went out. and the workers watched in silence as the gray hull kissed the waves. Someone started singing, "Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy," and the whole dock joined in, voices rising above the crash of steel and surf. From that day, the women with torches weren't just replacements. They were the builders of America's fleet. Each spark became a promise that the war wouldn't be won only on battlefields, but in places where fire met steel, and hands that had once held babies or typewriters now forged the bones of ships. In the dark, the yards still looked like a constellation, an industrial Milky Way where stars burned not in the sky, but in the hands of women. By the time Christmas came, they'd launched more ships than any navy in history. And for the first time since the war began, the headlines carried hope instead of loss. Because that winter, for the first time in 2 long years, the cracks were gone, and the ships began to fly off the docks again. Detroit had the car line. Richmond built the ship line. By 1943, the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California had become the beating heart of America's war machine, the largest industrial site on Earth. Day and night, the air shook with the clang of steel plates, the growl of cranes, and the hiss of 1,000 torches. What had once been a quiet bayfront was now a living, breathing factory city, glowing red against the fog. What Henry Kaiser had done was simple and revolutionary. He took Detroit's assembly line, turned it sideways, and set it afloat. Each ship began as a puzzle of enormous steel sections: bow, stern, deck, bulkheads. They were built separately, in different workshops, at the same time. The bow might be halfway finished before the stern even arrived at the yard. When every piece was ready, giant cranes lifted them into place like children stacking blocks, and the welders stitched the whole thing together. One engineer described it best. It looked like we were building skyscrapers sideways. The speed was staggering. A ship that once took half a year to complete now rolled into the ocean in 2 weeks, sometimes less. The shipyard ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts, no breaks. Trains delivered steel from Pittsburgh, trucks hauled engines from Detroit, and entire neighborhoods in Richmond lived by the rhythm of the whistle. The ship line became a spectacle. Reporters came from around the country just to see it. A forest of cranes moving in perfect choreography, steel panels sliding into place with a thunderous clang. Cameras caught the faces of workers grinning through soot and sparks, shouting across the noise, "Next one's ready." Every Liberty ship carried more than 250,000 parts, and every part fit perfectly. No customization, no artistry, no wasted motion. Efficiency was the only religion. Kaiser's motto was painted above the main gate. Nothing personal, just faster. It worked. At the height of production, a new Liberty ship launched every single day. The yards had to install a bell, the Victory Bell, to mark each one. Every time a ship slid down the greased wooden ramp into the water, the bell rang out across the bay. The sound became the heartbeat of the war effort. Workers would pause for a moment, wipe the sweat from their faces, and listen. Then they'd cheer, loud enough to drown the sirens. By the end of the war, that bell would ring 2,710 times. The ship line blurred the line between man and machine. Cranes moved like clock hands, welders moved like gears, and foremen barked orders that echoed off the water. The whole thing pulsed with mechanical grace. A newspaper columnist from Life magazine wrote, "If Henry Ford built cars for peace, Henry Kaiser builds oceans for war." There were moments of celebration too, launches that felt like holidays. Families came with banners, bands played swing tunes, and photographers flashed bulbs as each ship met the sea. Women in bandanas kissed their torches for luck. Men saluted the hulls they had built. But even amid the noise and pride, the truth was sobering. Many of those ships were carrying men who would never come back. Each vessel that rolled off the line was sent eastward, across an ocean still haunted by the U-boats. Some never made it past Newfoundland. Still, the workers kept going. In the Richmond cafeteria, someone pinned a sign above the door, "Build faster than they sink." And they did. When a message arrived that a Liberty ship had been lost at sea, it wasn't met with tears, just silence, then the sound of welders turning their torches back on. The yards became a place of ritual endurance. Every life lost was answered with another ship. Every sinking met with another launch. There was a strange poetry to the rhythm. In the dark, the cranes swung like metronomes over glowing hulls, and the workers' footsteps on steel echoed like drums. The war might be fought with bombs and guns, but here, the fight was with time. The workers began to measure their lives not in hours, but in ships. "What were you doing last week?" someone might ask. "2 ships," came the answer. At night, when the floodlights hit the fog, the entire harbor shimmered like a dream. 1,000 beams of light, endless sparks falling like golden rain. The smell of oil and salt mixed with the metallic scent of heat. In one photograph from 1944, a line of Liberty ships stretches across the horizon, each one marked with white letters on its gray hull. Behind them, cranes stand tall as monuments, silent for a moment between shifts. It looked eternal, indestructible. But even as America built faster than anyone in history, the ocean remained undefeated. The sea, cold and indifferent, waited. And somewhere in the Atlantic, Liberty ships were still vanishing, swallowed whole in the dark, without a trace. The workers didn't talk about that. They just built. Because for every ship that fell, there had to be another waiting on the ramp, ready to replace it before the echo of the last bell faded. But while America built ships faster than ever, the ocean was still swallowing them. In 1943 alone, the Atlantic claimed 226 Liberty ships. The shipyards didn't just fight deadlines, they fought death itself. Out on the open sea, the war was invisible until it wasn't. One minute the ocean was calm, steel gray, and endless. The next, a torpedo struck, and the horizon bloomed into fire. For the men aboard the Liberty ships, there was no front line, only the silence before the blast. They were called the workhorses of victory, but to the sailors, they were floating targets. Each carried 10,000 tons of cargo, food, fuel, tanks, ammunition, and the hope that the war could be supplied faster than it could be lost. The U-boats were waiting. They hunted by sound, by echo, by luck. The Germans called their campaign riddle tactic, wolf-pack tactics. The name fit. Convoys stretched for miles, gray shapes vanishing into fog, each one leaving a wake that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The escort destroyers zigzagged, dropping depth charges that thundered through the water. But for every submarine that died, another appeared. On February 19, 1943, the Liberty ship SS Nathaniel Bacon sent its last radio message. "We can see the torpedoes coming. 2-3. God help us." The ship sank in 6 minutes. Only half the crew survived. Back in Richmond, the loss was noted on the yard's message board. "Lost at sea. Replace in 5 days." No speeches. No mourning. The foreman just blew the whistle, and the next shift began. That was the battle the builders fought, not with rifles or bombs, but with time. The enemy was distance, fatigue, and the weight of knowing that what you built might already be sinking. Inside the shipyards, posters shouted optimism. Build faster than they sink. But under that slogan, there was exhaustion. Welders worked until their hands shook. Riveters dozed against steel walls between shifts. Nurses at the yard's clinic taped over burns and sent workers right back. Every delay, every pause, felt like a betrayal to the men dying out there. A worker named Joe Alvarez once said, "When a ship went down, we didn't cry. We welded harder." Every hammer strike became a heartbeat. Each spark, a flare for the ones who never came home. The Navy sent back reports of what survived. Some Liberty ships limped into port with their decks shattered, engines dead, hulls torn open, but still afloat. Sailors called them zombie ships. One captain wrote in his log, "She leaks, she groans, but she will not die." Those words reached Richmond. Someone painted them in white letters on the wall above the docks. It became the shipyard's unofficial motto. Meanwhile, the enemy grew desperate. The Germans had sunk more than 13 million tons of Allied shipping by 1943, yet new ships kept coming faster. They couldn't keep up. A Japanese admiral, reading intercepted U-boat reports, supposedly said, "We can sink them. We just can't sink them fast enough." The math of war had changed. Industrial tempo had become a weapon. Still, the cost was unbearable. Whole convoys vanished. Bodies washed ashore in Newfoundland and Scotland, tangled in life vests marked U.S. Merchant Marine. For every ship that made it, another fell silent beneath the waves. And yet, the shipyards grew louder. The Victory Bell in Richmond rang twice as often now. Each ring was both triumph and memorial. Evelyn Hartman once described it in her diary. It's a strange sound. It means a ship's alive, but someone's gone. On stormy nights, when fog covered the bay, she swore she could hear two echoes, one from the bell and another from far across the ocean, faint, delayed, as if the sea itself was answering. America's war effort had become a rhythm. Destruction answered by creation, loss answered by speed. The faster the U-boats struck, the faster the welders burned through steel. It was no longer a race between nations. It was a race between life and the abyss. By late 1944, the tide began to turn. Allied air patrols hunted the U-boats. New radar systems spotted periscopes before they could strike. The convoys grew safer. But no one in the yards relaxed. They kept building as if every delay meant another sinking, because once it had. One day, a telegram arrived for Henry Kaiser himself. It was short and signed. "Your ships saved us. We made it because of you. Tell them all. Thank you." He pinned it to the wall beside the production chart. No one dared take it down. That same week, another Liberty ship, the SS Helen O'Brien, crossed the Atlantic without incident. When the message reached Richmond, the yard erupted. Workers clapped, shouted, pounded the railings with wrenches. For the first time in months, they smiled. The bell rang once, clear and proud. For a moment, the war felt winnable. But the ocean was still out there, waiting, dark, endless, patient. And in that silence between bell strikes, everyone knew the truth. They weren't just building ships anymore. They were building a way to outrun death. For every ship that sank, two more were born. And somewhere in the Pacific, a Japanese admiral whispered, "We can't sink them fast enough." By 1945, America wasn't just winning the war. It was manufacturing victory. Across the country, from Portland to Mobile, from Baltimore to Richmond, the shipyards no longer sounded like chaos. They sounded like rhythm. Every clang, every whistle, every spark had merged into a single national heartbeat. The Liberty ships, those once doubted, welded together miracles, had become the arteries of the Allied world. They carried tanks to France, grain to England, fuel to Africa. Every hour they kept moving, the front lines advanced. Henry Kaiser called it the speed of democracy. It wasn't poetry, it was fact. In 4 years, his yards alone built more ships than the entire German Navy had launched in a decade. What began as an experiment had become an empire of motion. At Richmond, the sky was never dark. Floodlights bathed the bay in white. Cranes swung like clock hands, and torches glowed against the fog. It was the final year of the war, but no one slowed down. Not even after D-Day, not even when Paris was liberated. Because the ocean still needed ships. The soldiers still needed food. And the war, until it truly ended, still needed steel. Every morning, the victory bell rang. Another ship sliding into the water, another 14,000 tons of hope. The sound echoed over the bay, carried by gulls and foghorns, mixed with the laughter and coughs of exhausted workers. By then, most of them were veterans of a different kind of battle, the industrial front. Men whose hands were scarred from sparks. Women whose hair had long since turned gray from the smoke. Some had built a dozen ships, others hundreds. One of them, Helen O'Brien, the welder whose name now graced a Liberty ship, stood on the launch ramp that spring and watched her vessel sail away under its own power. The sun hit the water, and for a moment, the reflection looked like fire, the same fire she'd once held in her hands. "We didn't just build ships," she told a reporter quietly. "We built the road they sailed on." Behind her, the bell rang again. The numbers were staggering. In just over 4 years, America had built 2,710 Liberty ships, more than the rest of the world's merchant fleets combined. A country that had entered the war unprepared had become the greatest builder of ships in history. A government report in April 1945 read, "Industrial tempo has become a weapon as powerful as any bomb." When victory finally came, when the surrender cables flashed across the newswires, the yards didn't erupt in cheers. They just stopped. The whistles fell silent. The torches cooled. For the first time in 4 years, the night over Richmond went dark. Some workers cried. Some simply stood there, hands still trembling, unsure what to do without the rhythm that had defined their lives. The last Liberty ship rolled down the ramp in May 1945. The band played Anchors Aweigh. On the hull, painted in white block letters, were the words, For days. 14,000 tons. One nation. Henry Kaiser stood by the water, his suit covered in steel dust. When a reporter asked what he'd learned, he smiled faintly and said, "We learned that speed isn't about machines. It's about people who believe they can't stop." After the war, the shipyards emptied. Cranes rusted, the bell hung silent, and the wooden ramps rotted into the tide. The fog returned to Richmond Bay, quiet again for the first time since 1941. But sometimes, when the wind was right, locals swore they could still hear it. A distant clang, a faint hum, the echo of 1,000 torches in the dark. Evelyn Hartman kept her welding gloves until she died. They were stiff with soot and time. Her granddaughter once asked why she never cleaned them. Evelyn said, "Because that's what victory smells like." And somewhere across the ocean, the ships she built were still sailing, rusted, repainted, renamed, but alive. A few became fishing vessels, a few floating museums. Most were scrapped. Yet, even in pieces, they carried a legacy no ocean could drown. Those who had built them didn't call themselves heroes. They didn't call themselves anything at all. They just built. Faster. Stronger. Together. They proved that victory doesn't always come from courage or glory. Sometimes, it comes from a hand steadying a torch at midnight, from the hum of a factory that refuses to sleep, from people who believe that doing the impossible is just another day's work. When historians later calculated the war's turning points, they looked at battles, Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway. But they forgot the shipyards. The men and women who turned sparks into ships, who welded steel into survival. They were the quiet architects of victory. Because in the end, it wasn't generals or admirals who kept the world afloat. It was them. They said it was impossible to build a ship in 4 days. America didn't argue. It just did it.